you guys all for being here and for talking about this film with us. This is such a powerful film. I know that last scene is so intense. And Matt, I've seen all of your films basically so over the years, and you've been in some very, dangerous, combat-heavy situations. But as we're learning, as we're spending all this time in the Kabul airport, and then we find out that the next day was the terrorist attack. I mean, I'm sure it's really hard to talk about, but what must have been some of the things that went through your mind when you found out about that event happening right after you were there? I mean, and Tim and Caitlin as well. Some of the reactions.
Yeah, I mean, I'll never forget that Tim and I were there together in Kabul at the very end, and just sitting there at the Abbey Gate where the suicide attack happened, and seeing thousands and thousands of desperate civilians, many of whom have worked with the U.S., just trying to get out. And I've cried a lot in films that I made, often in the edit room or on the airplane or at home or when I wake up at night. I've never actually cried while filming. And both of us, we had tears streaming down our faces while we were filming. Just was a tragedy on a level that I've never ever experienced. And for everyone, I mean, even the 18-year-old Marines who are sitting there making these Sophie's Choice decisions on who to choose to come through, as the Taliban, it was just so surreal, as the Taliban was sitting on shipping crates watching us, as ISIS was in the hills watching all of us. And all I could think about was, what have we done? How did we get here? And yeah.
I think one thing that it comes through so powerfully in your films is like the camera as a real person. It's reacting in the way that a person would. It's feeling emotion. I mean, I'm sitting there watching tonight. I'm like, my heart is pounding so hard with these scenes in the helicopters at night. And I mean, you guys were there, so I would love to just talk to you a bit about like your process. And also, Tim, this is the first time you've collaborated with Matt. What was it like sort of coming on board and getting a shorthand or visual language as two different cinematographers working together?
Thank you. Well, when Matt first contacted me, it was I was a little starstruck, let's say. Cartel Land was one of my favorite documentaries. And I remember we were talking, and I said, look, Matt, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but I love the way you shoot. I notice the way you shoot, and I feel like I kind of shoot similar to you, where it's very much about the story. It may look nice, it may look attractive to some extent in the framing, but really it's about getting the story in the frame so that we can tell these people's stories. That's the one power that we have. With foreigners, we're allowed to come in and we're allowed to go home. And they have to live there every single day. So we have a huge responsibility. We have to go in there, capture their most intimate, most terrifying, scary moment in their life, and then bring it back and share it with Americans.
So when you were working with Tim, did you sort of tell him, give him any directives, like this is the visual, theme we're working with, or like what I really want you to capture or focus on?
I mean, by the time we got to the airport, we had been filming for many, many, many months, so we had a real deep shorthand. We could basically just sort of dance around each other. So many of these scenes in the film were the two of us moving around each other. We also had an amazing cinematographer, Olivier Sarbel, who worked on the film. And we all shoot just really similarly. And we talked for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks before the film actually started about my vision, how I like to shoot. We practiced a lot together. But definitely by the time we got to the airport, it was just instinctual. All instinctual.
So were all three of you shooting in all of these scenes at the same time?
No.
Okay.
No. There's certain scenes, there were maybe a couple scenes where all three of us were shooting, but mainly it was either two of us or just one of us, depending on what was happening. when like the scene up in the helicopter, that was just me alone. You can't have multiple people. Other scenes, there's other people in the helicopter. So it just depended on sort of what was happening at a given time. And the goal always is, in this type of filmmaking, is to try to become part of the fabric of the daily lives of our characters, especially with General Sadat, in filming such intimate quarters, intimate spaces. As his country was crumbling around him, the last thing in the world we wanted to do was be an impediment on him, slow him down, put pressure on him with the camera. And so we really, really built that trust over weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. So we really just became part of the fabric of his life and the life of his men. That was the goal, at least. And the goal really, from a sort of directing point of view, is I want you all to feel like you're there. I want you all to feel what it's like to be in those rooms, to almost feel like you're feeling the wind in the deserts of Afghanistan, to feel the sweat as you're pushed against the wall at the North Gate in the airport. I want you to feel those things viscerally and emotionally and in your heart. And maybe, just maybe, if we've accomplished just a little bit of that, you'll care just a little bit more.
So I want to go back now to the beginning, because the way this film started out, it was not about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It was about, you were embedded with Green Berets, and then this event happens and you have to quickly pivot. So Caitlin, can you talk a little bit about like originally what the project was, and then what it's like, especially as a producer, to have to turn that ship around?
Stressful.
Yeah, I bet.
So the way I contextualize the journey of this film is when we very first started discussing the access with the U.S. Army Green Berets, I was not yet pregnant with my second child, and that kid's now 3 years old. So it took a long time. It took a long time of conversation without cameras to get access to the U.S. Military Special Operations community, which I'm sure you can imagine is pretty closed community traditionally, and are not that excited about having cameras following them. But I think that they felt the value of this for a number of reasons. Them feeling the value of this took a lot of conversation, and it also took a lot of conversation on the part of Matt and I with them in the early days as to the fact that we really weren't intending with this film to interrogate the war, prosecute the war, ask questions about why the war was happening. Really, truly in the style of Matt's films, we wanted to just have the opportunity to be present for what these men were experiencing on a deployment that we did not know at that time would be the last deployment. So when we sent our team to Afghanistan to initially film with the Green Berets, we thought we had this extraordinary access to this, typically closed community where we can see how they were performing their duties with the partner force, the Afghans they were working with. We knew it was sort of edging on the 20-year anniversary of the war, and that was interesting to us. It was an interesting framework through which to look at their experience. But we didn't know. No one had any, Trump was still president when we were conceiving of this film, and then when Biden came to office and made his decision, that decision occurred, as you see on screen, in front of our Green Berets and in front of our cameras. The pivot was, I think, Tim had initially met General Sadat because Tim was with that Green Beret team, and that Green Beret team that you see is obviously working with General Sadat, and was saying, this guy's a really extraordinary figure. So then Matt and I began engaging with him. He also took a little while to feel comfortable filming with us, but when the Green Berets had to leave, fairly precipitously, as you see, and we knew that the story was going to continue to unfold in a way we couldn't predict, but we knew it felt historic. Being able to continue with General Sadat afforded us that ability to have a front row seat to what would become history. So the pivot, it was very difficult logistically, but it felt storytelling-wise like an inevitability.
And just like from a sort of nerdy point of view, like, does the military access start to change when they're like, we're going into retrograde? Like, how do you get to film that? Did they just like let you stay?
Well, this is something that we all, I think, can talk about, and both of these guys should talk about this as well. But the access it wasn't like we went to a general years ago and said, please give us access to a U.S. Army Green Beret team, and that occurred. And then that access was sort of fait accompli and it was easy sailing from then on. That was not the case. It was a negotiation every single day.
Constant negotiation.
Constant negotiation of, are you okay today? What else do you have going on that we can't see or that we don't know about? How can we negotiate to stay as close to you as possible, stay as close to your daily reality as possible, whether that's beginning to retrograde or whether that's working with your Afghan partner forces or, but every day those questions had to be asked and it depended on, you know, how did their conversation go with their wives the night before? How are they feeling personally in this long deployment they were on that, as you see, was in some ways quite frustrating, but I don't know, you guys might have more thoughts on that as well, what that daily negotiation was.
Oh yeah, I mean, that was a fight. I mean, they're Green Berets. They work in the shadows. They, you know, having a camera crew following around is really the opposite of what they're trained to do. So, but specifically to your question about how did they let us film Retrograde, they wanted us to film it. Mm-hmm. That's when things changed. Mm-hmm. It's 20 years. There are fathers who have their own sons who are deployed to Afghanistan. They have lost loads of colleagues, many friends, many buddies have been killed. 20 years of fighting, and it's a big question mark for them. Like, what happened? How are we at this point? What are we doing now? They actually wanted us to document this. Mm-hmm. It was very, very, very emotional for every American soldier. Yeah. The ones on the ground and all the hundreds of thousands of veterans who have returned from their deployments there. Mm-hmm. There was one Green Beret there who, not on my team, it was his 14th deployment.
I mean, I was so surprised, like, sort of seeing some of their reactions. Like, were you ever sort of taken by surprise as to, you know, how they were reacting, or had you gotten to know them really well and you wanted to capture what they were feeling in those moments? I guess it's just like a representation of Green Berets that you don't really see in media, if that makes sense.
Well, one thing I can say, I think that, you know, Green Berets in particular, one thing that was interesting to us was differentiating. They're not Navy SEALs, and there's a lot of representation of Navy SEALs in U.S. media. So, you know, guys who drop it in the middle of the night from off a helicopter and, you know, perform a kill capture mission. That happens, that's been depicted. Green Berets are this particular sect within the U.S. Special Operations community that's really, they can also perform that sort of mission, but their real primary purpose is to partner with a foreign force and try to bolster that foreign force. So, as Tim says, some of these guys had spent their entire adult lives going in and out of Afghanistan fighting with the Afghan army in some capacity. Some of them, you know, had, you know, one guy had 14 deployments. Others of them had been, you know, to this base that we were at. That was an enormous base 10 years ago. You know, it was like a small city in the desert. And then it shrunk, you know, so much over the years. So there was just such history there, you know, and I think just that they're just like a very particular, they're a force that is, you know, they have a very particular purpose and they had a very particular reason for being there. And I think that they were interested in letting us document that and capture that because it sort of hadn't really been deeply before.
You know, I felt very strongly as when the Green Berets left that we didn't have a movie. And so it was absolutely necessary to either not have a movie and give up or figure out how to finish this story. And finishing that story meant calling General Sadat and asking him, can we come back and can we spend time with you? Can we experience whatever might happen through your eyes? There's been a lot of war films about Afghanistan. There's been a lot of war documentaries. Tim shot a lot of those documentaries. But you know, this prism through which to view retrograding a war zone, leaving a war zone, the end of a war, through the eyes of a general who's responsible for 15,000 men and women, was a pretty unique prism through which to try to see this story. And then that prism, the aperture of that obviously opened up even further in the third act of the film when, you know, everything fell apart and how men took over, and you know, it was really important to me and to us to open up the aperture to see how this was affecting, you know, civilians. And you know, by the end of the film, we'd actually really been able to see all the different players, U.S. military, Afghan military, civilians, and then the Taliban meeting that we stumbled into.
Just, about sort of like the storytelling from both an edit perspective and a camera perspective, I was struck so much by the use faces in storytelling, and that you're not really telling us this is this political message or this is what we should feel about this, but you're just using the faces of Sadat and the Green Berets and then the people on the ground. And I mean, I was just so struck by that because it's bringing us into the humanity and the humanitarian crisis of the situation. And so was that something that you were focusing on very much specifically in shooting and then also in the edit?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a lot about, I love holding on shots for like an uncomfortable amount of time. And, the goal always is to, every cinematographer's goal is to have a, 3-minute one take, and not allow the editor to ever make a cut. But yeah, the motif of holding on faces was something that was very much thought about in the field while shooting, but absolutely thought about in the edit room. Became a motif, sort of an emotional motif that starts really as the Green Berets emote over the retrograding, over the Biden's announcement, and carries all the way to the end with the final shot of that young woman staring through the fence. And I think each of these faces obviously represents something different, but in a sense, it's us trying to allow you to think about, what if that was you? What if that was your brother or your sister or your mother or your cousin? Because these conflicts can feel so distant. We sit here in the luxury of, are we in Hollywood? Where are we?
Yeah-ish, yeah.
Hollywood, wherever we are, we're in LA.
Are we?
But we're so fortunate to be living where we're living, to have the freedoms that we have. And the new conflict du jour is Ukraine. Afghanistan is in sort of the far recesses of our memory. And so I really, really hope that this film can help create a dialogue again about Afghanistan, but also about foreign policy, about how we engage with the rest of the world, and how we leave these countries behind. Afghanistan is worse off than it was 20 years ago. And women can't walk outside without their faces covered. Girls can't go to school. So it's a tragedy, and I think that I just hope, among many things, that this film starts dialogue again about the way we interact with the rest of the world.
That shot of the young woman at the end is so striking to me because I felt like it was like the first time we saw a woman in this movie, like uncovered. And did you always sort of know, like, we're gonna end on something like this, or was that something that you landed on in various edits?
I mean, it's a strange kind of last 5 minutes of a movie because there's no dialogue, and it's just images with music. That was a late night reactionary thing that I cut after having a horrible feedback screening, and just wanted to change the tenor of what we left the audience feeling. So she was earlier in the film, about 15 minutes earlier, and decided to sort of reorchestrate the ending to be sort of leading up to that moment.
I remember when he sent me that moment and said, it was literally like in the middle of the night, like, okay, I redid this. And that, obviously, that image is so iconic. That way, the second they brought that back from the field and we were looking at it, it's so iconic, and it says so much, and it leaves you with questions, and it leaves you a lot of emotion. So I think the move, once you did it, it actually felt really natural that it would land where it did. But yeah, we had it earlier for a long time.
Well, we are going to move on to audience questions. If you all have some questions, and I will just make the request, if you have a comment, please save it for after. Questions only. Comments over wine. Questions now. Yes, in the back.
So the last day at the airport, at what point were you like, okay, we gotta leave right now?
So the question is, when did you decide to leave the airport?
We didn't decide. We were forced to leave. we actually would have stayed longer if we could have. There had been a lot of reports of an imminent attack. It's a perfect environment for a terrorist attack. Massive groups of civilians packed into concentrated areas. You've probably seen it on the news, bombs going off in Iraq in marketplaces or in hospitals and things like this. It was just a question of time. And there was a lot of intel floating around, which luckily we sort of were privy to thanks to our contacts. And it came to a point where it didn't happen that day, it didn't happen the next day. And then one day the US military just said, you got to go now. And they put us on a plane and sent us out. But we would have definitely stayed.
And it's a long story. I mean, we when we went back on that final trip, we thought we were going to go film with General Sadat for 2, 3, 4 weeks, maybe even a couple months. It was not a fait accompli that it was all going to end, and we ended up flying commercially to Dubai, and then we actually took the last commercial flight to Kabul. And as the plane went to land, the pilot got on the intercom and said, "There's a plane on the tarmac, so we're gonna have to circle for a little bit." And we all got on we're so low that we could actually get cell service. And we found out that the Taliban had taken over Kabul and that plane was the president fleeing. So then we spent the next 3 or 4 days, every single minute of every single day of every single night, trying to figure out how to sneak back in the country. So when we eventually got back in, we filmed some at the airport, then we left the airport and went out into the city, filmed for a couple of days, and then came back to inside the airport for the final couple of days of shooting.
Yes, right here in front.
How many hours total footage did you have from start to finish to bring it down to 96 minutes? And please talk about your process as to what you decided would go in and so much that would make it in.
So the question is about the hours and the process of cutting it down to 96 minutes.
I think we had something like 1,300 or 1,400 hours. A lot of brutal decisions. I mean, the film easily could have been 2, 3, 4 hours, and decently compelling 2 or 3, 4 hours. But the films that I like to watch and the films that I like to make, that we like to make, are character-driven films. And so, creating that narrative arc with General Sadat, first seeding that with his relationship with the Green Berets, and then obviously when the rug is pulled out and he's left alone, as the second act begins. The film sort of ended up having this very sort of natural, sort of classic structure. It took a long time actually to find that, but it probably seems quite obvious here. But it took a while for us to find that.
Yes, right back here.
You stumbled into the speech of when the Taliban were there, and I'd like to hear about that because that's pretty extraordinary. You're Americans and you're shooting cameras. Australian.
We had heard that this Taliban meeting was happening through a few contacts, and we drove up and literally knocked on their door and said, "Can we come in and film?" And they said yes, and we went in and filmed.
Pretty extraordinary. They wanted the world to see.
I think, at that point, it probably seems crazy from the outside. It was definitely scary. We definitely done scarier things in this movie. Our hearts were definitely beating when we walked in, but it would have been really bad for them to do something to us at that point. They were playing nice with the international community, with the international media, and to do something to two American and Australian journalists, whatever we are, would have been really bad press for them. And there's a ticking clock of when the U.S. was going to leave, and so they were just pretending like they were going to be progressive in their government and their choices, and they were playing nice with the U.S. military. So while it was, a bit scary, we knew it would have been really dumb for them to do something to us.
Was one thing that Matt didn't know about that happened right before this? Can I tell this story?
Please.
So Matt was actually trying to get us access to this, and he was just a little further away, and I was standing back with the driver, and Kabul was full of young Taliban, high on bravado. They've just won victory, so confident, so cocky, in their 20s, give or take. And at one moment, while I was standing next to the car looking for Matt, thinking, when's he coming back, they surrounded me. There was a group of young guys. And one of them asked me, so where are you from? I said, I'm from Australia. He said, I'm from Jalalabad. There are a lot of Australian soldiers in Jalalabad. I used to kill Australian soldiers in Jalalabad. I was looking, where's Matt? Matt? Yeah, you didn't know that. But we went in anyway, and, they wanted us there. The fact of the matter is they wanted us there. They want to prove that they're a legitimate ruling government and that they can take over and do things for their country better than the government prior.
Which was all a farce, obviously.
Okay, we have time for one more question right back here.
The general Sadat's such an incredible character, such a brave character, obviously. You can see everything kind of collapsing around him, and he gets more and more exhausted. How did his kind of attitude towards you guys filming him and his motivation for being the subject change? And was there a moment that you sensed this was the moment where he sort of lost hope in defending Afghanistan?
To me, I hope the film is saying hundreds of different things. But in terms of General Sadat, I also hope it's saying many different things. But I think one of the things that's amazing about him as a subject, is that every neon sign was saying, stop, give up, this is over. And he had this blind faith that maybe, just maybe, if he held on to Lashkar-Gah or Helmand, that they could beat back the Taliban. And he was unwavering in that belief all the way to the end. I mean, obviously there's this scene with the head of police in Lashkar-Gah challenging him, telling him, you have to pay attention, like, we don't have planes, we don't have resources, the shops are closing, and Sammy got mad and said, I bit my lip. Why are you telling me these things? I think, especially Tim and I, having spent so much time with him, had enormous respect that he had really allowed us to stay through all those really difficult moments. I mean, his country was literally crumbling around him, and he still allowed us to be there at every second along the way. I mean, we were filming when he woke up in the morning to when he was brushing his teeth and went to bed at night. I think the hardest thing, and I don't know if you agree or disagree, but I think one of the hardest things was when we met him in London. He was really struggling. And I really was trying to get him to talk about what he was feeling. And he sort of refused. And so there's a fair amount of tension between us in those final days. Not like combative tension, just me trying to get him to speak about it, and him sort of really not wanting to. And his face, again, going back to faces, his face ended up saying everything that his mouth could have said.
You go. You go.
I was just going to say that for Sammy, failure is not an option. And for him to demonstrate any weakness whatsoever is a failure of leadership. And so he would never even, I can't even imagine it even crossed his mind that he could lose Helmand and that Afghanistan could fall to the Taliban. It's just, and he personified that mentality, because he knew that he had to, if he wanted anyone to follow him and anyone to go into battle for him. And so I think when he was forced to leave, it must have been shattering to who he is as a leader, as a person.
And we were just this morning in Zurich at the Zurich Film Festival. Sorry for a bit tired. And he wasn't able to come to the premiere at Telluride, but he was able to come to Zurich. And it was the first time saw the film with an audience. We showed him the film previously, but he had never seen it with an audience in a big theater. And that was, I think, the first time I'd ever seen him really admit how emotional he was. I mean, he could barely sort of speak during the Q&A. And yeah.
The one, it was unbelievable. Us watching him, watching the film in a big theater with a whole group of people. But then afterwards, one thing that he could speak about and was so clear about, and I think if he were here, he'd probably say this, and tell me if you guys agree, he actually never really lost hope. He, as Tim is saying and as Matt's saying, he couldn't allow himself to the point where when you ask him now what's going to happen, he says, I am going to go back in and overthrow the Taliban. That's what's going to happen. That's what I'm doing now. And he would obviously get the question, the obvious question, you know, General, what are you doing next? What's happening now? And he is just declarative and adamant about that. And don't you think, you guys, in a way, that's his way of coping, of being able to, he can't dwell in the pain. He has to look forward and think about what he can do next, because I don't think he can live with the idea that he lost, or that his country is now run by the Taliban or controlled by the Taliban. So, yeah, I think it's a really interesting study in, as you guys are saying, in a leader who cannot accept failure.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you all for your thoughtful questions and for being here tonight and for this amazing film.